Tonight we walk beyond the bright ring of the ancient city, beyond the walls where torches burned at the gates, beyond the last familiar stones worn smooth by generations of sandals, beyond the shrines where fathers had poured wine, mothers had whispered prayers, and children had learned the names of the gods. Tonight we follow the road of the banished. For the ancient Greeks, exile was not a simple punishment. It was not merely a journey away from home, nor a change of address beneath another sky. It was a tearing away from the very substance of life. To be exiled was to be cut from the city that had given you law, language, honour, protection, burial, and sacred memory. It was to stand outside the community of the living, though the body still breathed. It was to become a man without a hearth, without ancestral dust beneath his feet, without the right to stand among his own people when the gods were called upon. In the imagination of Greece, gods and mortals once walked the earth together. The mountains had voices, the groves were watched, the sea was not empty water, but a dark and glittering road of divine anger, sudden rescue, and shipwrecked fate. In such a world, belonging mattered with a force difficult for the modern mind to fully measure. A person did not simply live in a city, he was woven into it. His name belonged to its records. His sacrifices belonged to its altars. His dead belonged to its soil. His honour belonged to the eyes of those who knew his father and grandfather. So what was a person when all of that was stripped away? That question haunted the Greek world for centuries. Imagine Athens under the pale gold light of morning. The Acropolis rises like a sacred ship above the city, its stones still bright in the sun. Below it lie narrow streets, workshops ringing with bronze, courtyards filled with smoke from cooking fires, and the murmuring life of a people who believed that public existence was the core of human dignity. The citizen moved through this world not as an isolated individual, but as part of a sacred and political order. He spoke in the assembly, he served in the army, he watched the festivals, he took his place in the theatre, where poets gave shape to terror, pride, pity, and divine law. Yet this same city, capable of philosophy, drama, architecture, and political brilliance, also possessed a colder power. It could expel. It could name a man dangerous. It could remove him from sight. It could send him away not only from streets and houses, but from the living memory of his community. Banishment was feared because the city was not merely a place, it was the world. The Greek word for city carried a depth beyond stone walls and crowded markets. The city was the body of citizens, the land they defended, the gods they honoured, and the laws they obeyed. It was a parent, a judge, a battlefield, and a temple. To be cast out from it was to lose the frame through which life made sense. A man condemned to death might face a final terror, sharp and irreversible. The cup, the blade, the fall, the spear. But exile was stretched across time. It continued each dawn. It followed the banished person into foreign ports, mountain villages, and hostile courts. It sat beside him when he ate unfamiliar bread among strangers. It lay beside him when sleep would not come. It whispered that every road led away from the graves of his ancestors. There was a darkness in that punishment because it left the victim alive enough to understand everything he had lost. In the oldest Greek stories, wandering is rarely innocent. The sea tosses heroes from island to island. Murderers flee from blood guilt. Kings are driven from their thrones. Men who offend gods or kin find themselves homeless beneath wide and pitiless skies. The exile becomes a figure of uncertainty, sometimes polluted, sometimes heroic, sometimes both. He may return with vengeance. He may found a new city. He may die unknown in foreign dust. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden in the silence between myth and law, between poetry and lived experience. The terror of exile was sharpened by religion. Every household had its sacred fire. Every family honoured its dead. Every city had protective deities whose favour could not simply be packed into a travelling bag. Leaving meant separation from rituals that marked the seasons, guarded the house, and join the living to the invisible powers. In a world where misfortune could be read as divine anger, the Exiles stood exposed. He had lost not only neighbours, but the web of rights that held chaos at bay. There was also the question of burial. To the Greeks, the treatment of the dead was not a minor concern. A body left unburied, or buried far from kin, could become a wound in the moral order. Exile raised the possibility that one might die in a place where no sun closed the eyes, no relative poured offerings, no familiar voice spoke the final words. Death itself became lonelier at the edge of another people's land. Then came property, that hard and practical truth beneath the poetry of loss. Banishment could mean confiscation. Houses could be emptied. Farms could pass into other hands. Wealth could vanish into legal decree. A man outside the city could not easily defend his estate, protect his household, or secure his children's future. His enemies remained present. He was absent, and absence, in politics, is often fatal. The exile was also dangerous to others. He carried grievance like a hidden blade. He might seek shelter with rivals. He might return with soldiers. He might whisper to foreign kings about weak harbours, divided councils, and gates left careless in the night. The banished man was pitied, feared, and watched. His suffering did not remove him from history. It could make him more powerful, more desperate, and more terrible. This is why Greek cities feared exiles almost as much as citizens feared becoming them. The punishment created shadows outside the walls. Men driven away did not vanish into nothing. They gathered in borderlands, in courts, in mercenary camps, and in the service of ambitious rulers. They remembered every insult. They counted every year. They waited for factions to shift, wars to begin, enemies to weaken, and friends to open a path home. Banishment was meant to protect the city from danger, but it could plant the seeds of future violence in the dark soil beyond its reach. And yet exile was not always presented as cruelty. Sometimes it was described as mercy. A city that banished rather than executed could imagine itself restrained. It had spared blood. It had avoided a corpse. It had removed conflict without staining the altar. But mercy can wear a severe face. To live without belonging, to survive without honour, to age beneath foreign stars while one's name curdles in the mouths of enemies, was a punishment that entered the soul slowly. There lies the dark truth. Ancient Greek exile was feared because it attacked the complete human being. It struck the body by forcing hardship. It struck the household by breaking inheritance and protection. It struck the mind by replacing honour with uncertainty. It struck the soul by severing sacred bonds. It struck memory by threatening to remove a person from the story his own people told about themselves. The road of exile began at the city gate, but it did not end there. It entered dreams. It followed bloodlines. It shaped politics, literature, war, and philosophy. It asked whether a person remained himself when the city no longer recognized him. It asked whether identity lived in the heart or in the eyes of others. It asked what home truly meant when law, gods, and ancestors stood behind locked gates, under the stars of the Aegean world, where black ships crossed moonlit water and distant hills held the ruins of forgotten kings. The banished walked on. Some cursed the city that cast them out. Some begged the gods for return. Some sharpened their anger into rebellion, or some faded into silence. And still, answerless, adrift to ponder, we are left with the same unsettling vision, a human figure standing beyond the walls, listening to the sounds of his own city continuing without him. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And wherever you're listening from tonight, write your location and your local time in the comments, so that for a brief moment, across continents and across darkness, we may all gather at the same ancient gate. To understand the fear of banishment in ancient Greece, one must first enter the city not as a tourist among ruins, but as a living citizen beneath the eyes of gods, ancestors, neighbours, and law. The Greek city was not an address. It was not a convenient centre of trade. It was not simply a cluster of houses pressed inside defensive walls. It was a sacred organism, breathing through festivals, speaking through assemblies, remembering through tombs, and judging through the gaze of the community. A man belonged to his city almost as a limb belongs to a body. From the first light of morning, the city announced itself through sound and ritual. Roosters cried in courtyards, smoke rose from hearths, artisans opened shutters, donkeys moved beneath loads of oil jars and grain sacks. At street corners, neighbours exchanged words that were never merely casual, for reputation lived in every greeting. Above the roof stood temples, altars, and sacred stones, fixed reminders that the city was watched by powers older than any magistrate. For the Greeks, citizenship was not only a legal condition, it was an inherited place within a moral universe. The citizen had a father's name, a family line, a neighbourhood, a tribe, a set of cults, and a recognised share in common life. His body could be called to war. His voice could be counted in political decision. His presence could be required at festivals. His household could be known by its sacrifices, marriages, debts, quarrels, and honours. To be inside the city was to be legible. The exile became illegible. The city gave shape to memory. It told a person where he stood in time. Here was the grave of an ancestor. Here was the shrine where a mother prayed in childbirth. Here was the training ground where young men learned discipline. Here was the marketplace where laws were posted. Rumours grew and reputations were made. Here was the theatre where myths were not dead stories, but public mirrors held before the face of the people. The city was a vast container of meaning. When Greek poets and historians described human life, they rarely imagined greatness outside community. A lonely man might be divine or bestial, but ordinary human dignity required a place among others. The citizen's value emerged in public action. He spoke well, fought bravely, sacrificed properly, judged fairly, married honourably, and preserved his household. These were not private achievements hidden within the heart. They were seen. That visibility could be merciless. The same civic world that granted honour could also strip it away. A city loved order, but feared corruption. It honoured courage, but feared ambition. It praised noble birth, but feared over-mighty families. It needed leaders, yet dreaded the man who rose too high. In this tension, banishment became one of the city's most haunting tools. It did not merely punish a crime. It declared that a person no longer belonged within the sacred body. There was deep religious force behind this idea. Greek religion was not confined to grand temples with marble columns. It lived in households, boundary markers, groves, springs, crossroads, and tombs. Every place had obligations. Every act of public life carried sacred undertones. Oaths were sworn before gods. Treaties were sealed with sacrifice. Armies marched after omens. Assemblies gathered in spaces marked by ritual order. Law and religion were not sealed apart as separate chambers. They flowed into one another like rivers meeting in low country. The citizen, then, was bound by invisible threads. He owed respect to the gods of the city, to the dead of his family, to the customs of his fathers, to the legal decisions of his peers, and to the military defence of the land. His identity did not float freely. It was anchored. Exile cut the anchor. A banished person might still speak Greek. He might still remember the songs, the myths, the taste of olives from home, the smell of rain on familiar stone. Yet he lacked the recognised setting that made these memories socially real. Among strangers, his noble lineage might mean little. His old victories might be doubted. His enemies could define him from afar. His children might grow in another city, speaking with another accent, praying at other altars. Learning that home was a story rather than a street, the fear of this loss began long before any formal sentence was passed. It lived in the structure of Greek society. A citizen was trained to care intensely about honour because honour was social oxygen. To lose standing was to suffocate slowly in public. Shame was not merely an inward feeling. It was an event that happened between people. The lowered eyes of a neighbour, the mocking line of a comic poet, the hostile silence of an assembly, the refusal of allies to speak your name with respect. All these could wound more deeply than a blade. Banishment concentrated shame into geography. The city gate became a line between the recognised and the erased. Inside lay the world where a man's name had weight. Outside lay uncertainty. The stones themselves seemed to judge. The road did not simply lead to another place. It led away from lawful identity, away from the fields that fed the household, away from the graves that demanded offerings, away from the festivals that renewed belonging year after year. At the centre of this terror stood the household hearth. The hearth was warmth, food, continuity, and sacred presence. Around it, the family gathered. At it, offerings were made. Through it, the living household touched something enduring. To be forced from one's hearth was not only to lose comfort, it was to lose the small sacred centre from which a life was ordered. A foreign fire might warm the hands, but it could not easily replace the flame of origin. The Greeks understood borders with emotional intensity. Boundary stones marked land. City walls marked protection. Sacred precincts marked divine space. Tombs marked the territory of memory. Exile violated all these boundaries at once. The banished man crossed from known to unknown, from kin to stranger, from citizen to dependent guest. He might seek shelter, but shelter was not belonging. He might receive hospitality, but hospitality was temporary, conditional, and often humiliating. Even friendship changed under exile. A man at home could give favours. A man in exile needed them. He became a supplicant, a guest, a political risk. Those who received him might do so from pity, calculation, or hostility toward his city. Every meal could carry obligation. Every gift could become a chain. Every promise of protection could be withdrawn when fortune shifted. Thus the polis, the Greek city, was feared not only because it could kill, but because it could define reality. It could say who was lawful and who was polluted, who was honoured and who was dangerous, who belonged among the living civic body and who must walk outside it. That power gave banishment its terrible depth. The exile did not lose only land. He lost the public agreement that made him fully himself, and in that ancient world of bronze helmets, dust-bright roads, harbour winds, incense smoke, and crowded assemblies, such a loss could feel like falling out of the human order entirely. The walls remained standing. The altars continued to smoke. The markets opened, the festivals came, the city endured. But for the one cast out, the world had been broken at its centre. Beneath the hard blue sky of Athens, democracy learned to fear its own giants. The city that praised public speech, rewarded military brilliance, and filled its monuments with the memory of heroic deeds also lived with a persistent anxiety. What if one citizen became too powerful? What if admiration turned into obedience? What if noble service became personal rule? What if the crowd, dazzled by victory, thus gave one man the shadow of kingship? Out of this fear came one of the strangest political rituals in the ancient world. Ostracism. It was not a trial in the ordinary sense. It did not demand proof of a specific crime. It did not always name treason, murder, sacrilege, or theft. It did not necessarily declare that the chosen man was wicked. Instead, it asked the citizens a colder and more unsettling question. Who among us has become too dangerous to remain? The answer was scratched onto broken pottery. Picture the scene. A civic gathering in the open air. Dust rising beneath thousands of feet. Men crowding into the appointed space. Some thoughtful, some angry, some led by rumour, some by loyalty, some by old resentment. In their hands were shards of pottery, humble fragments from jars, cups, and vessels once used in kitchens, shops, and households. Upon these pieces, citizens inscribed a name, a statesman, a general, a rival, a man whose greatness had begun to cast too long a shadow. The object was common, almost worthless. Yet in that moment it became an instrument of political removal. A broken scrap of clay could help send a man from Athens for years. It is difficult to imagine a more haunting symbol. The daily material of ordinary life turned into a weapon of civic judgment. Archaeological discoveries have made this ritual vivid with an intimacy rare in ancient history. Excavations in Athens have uncovered large numbers of ostraca, the inscribed pottery fragments used in ostracism. They bear the names of famous men, scratched unevenly, sometimes confidently, sometimes clumsily. Some were clearly written by different hands. Others suggest organised political efforts, with repeated names prepared in advance. Through stratigraphic excavation and careful study of context, scholars have been able to place many of these finds within the physical life of the city, not as abstract constitutional theory, but as objects handled by real citizens on charged political days. These shards whisper of a democracy alert to danger, but also vulnerable to persuasion. Ostracism was designed as a bloodless safety valve. The city had known tyranny. It remembered families that had ruled too much, ambitions that had pressed too close to monarchy, and factions that could tear public life apart, rather than wait for civil violence. Athens created a method of temporary expulsion. The chosen man would leave, but his property was not necessarily destroyed. His family was not automatically ruined. His honour might survive. In theory, the city was not taking revenge. It was creating distance. Yet distance can be a form of death when reputation is the breath of life. To be ostracised was to discover that the city's love had limits. One could win battles, command fleets, build alliances, and speak with brilliance, yet still awaken to the murmuring realization that too many citizens had written one's name in clay. There is a particular terror in not being condemned for one clear act, but for one's very weight in the world. The ostracized man was not always told, "You have done this evil." He was told more mysteriously, "Your presence has become unsafe." Among those touched by this ritual were some of the most famous figures in Athenian history. Aristides, remembered as just, was sent away despite his reputation for fairness. Themistocles, whose naval vision helped save Greece from Persian invasion, later found himself rejected by the city he had defended. Cimon, a leading commander and aristocratic figure, also endured removal. Their stories reveal that ostracism did not fall only upon obvious villains. It could strike the admired, the useful, the celebrated, and the brilliant. This made it more frightening. A criminal may understand why punishment comes. A powerful citizen under democracy could never be entirely certain when admiration would curdle into suspicion. The applause of the people was unstable. The same assembly that cheered a victory might later resent the victor. The same citizens who trusted a general with ships and men might decide that his name had become too large for the civic body to contain. Here lies one of the darker truths of the Greek political imagination. The city desired excellence but feared domination. It needed men of ability, yet watched them with narrowed eyes. It praised service to the common good, but punished the appearance of becoming indispensable. In a culture that revered heroic fame, the democratic city created a ritual to humble heroes before they could become masters. The pottery shard was therefore more than a ballot. It was a warning. No citizen, however glorious, stood above the city. No lineage, victory, wealth, or reputation could guarantee safety if the collective will turned cold. The crowd might be generous, but it could also be implacable. It could look upon a great man and see not a protector, but a future tyrant. It could read ambition in posture, danger in popularity, monarchy in charisma, The man selected for ostracism walked away under a peculiar burden. He was not executed. He was not necessarily disgraced beyond repair. Yet he carried the mark of civic distrust. The city had chosen emptiness over his presence. It had declared that Athens felt safer when he was elsewhere. Imagine the final hours before departure, a household disturbed by packing, servants whispering, friends arriving with guarded faces, enemies perhaps satisfied, though careful not to appear too triumphant, the harbour waiting, the roads open, the Acropolis visible above the roofs, no longer a symbol of shared belonging but a monument receding into distance. And what did the city feel when the ostracised man vanished from its streets? Perhaps relief, perhaps pride in its own restraint, perhaps the uneasy quiet that follows a storm. The marketplace continued, courts convened, ships sailed, sacrifices smoked before the gods. The democratic body had removed a perceived danger without civil slaughter, yet the shards remained. Those fragments of pottery survive as some of the most intimate witnesses to ancient political fear. They preserve not only names, but anxieties. They show a society experimenting with the problem of power, asking how a free community might protect itself from the men it most admired. They reveal democracy not as a simple triumph of reason, but as a living organism of hope, jealousy, caution, memory, and dread. Ostracism made banishment ritualistic. It transformed public suspicion into a civic ceremony. It allowed ordinary citizens to participate in the controlled exile of greatness. And for the man whose name appeared too often in scratched clay, it proved that one could stand at the summit of honour and still be sent into the silence beyond the walls. In Athens, the people did not need a sword to remove you. Sometimes a broken piece of pottery was enough. Long before magistrates counted votes, long before pottery shards carried the scratched names of powerful men, the Greek imagination had already filled exile with terror. In the deep chambers of myth, banishment was not a dry legal sentence. It was a curse with dust on its feet, blood on its hands, and the breath of angry gods behind it. The earliest wanderers of Greek story did not leave home lightly. They fled murder, prophecy, violated kinship, divine wrath, and crimes so terrible that ordinary life could no longer contain them. They moved through a landscape where every mountain pass might conceal judgment, every river might demand purification, every stranger's doorway might become either refuge or doom. In these stories, exile was not simply removal from a city. It was evidence that the world itself had been disturbed. Consider the cursed house of Thebes, where kingship, prophecy, blindness, and blood became tangled in one of the darkest patterns of Greek memory. A child marked for death survives. A man kills a stranger on the road, not knowing the stranger is his father. A king solves the riddle of the Sphinx, rises to glory, marries the queen, and discovers that triumph has been built upon horror. When truth breaks open, sight itself becomes unbearable. The royal house becomes a place of pollution, and the road calls again. The figure of Oedipus, aged and cast out, leaning upon his daughter in the dust, became one of the most powerful images of exile in all ancient literature. He is not merely a fallen king. He is a man who carries unbearable knowledge. The city that once depended upon him cannot hold him in the same way. He has become sacred and dangerous, pitiable and frightening. His body moves through the world like a living wound, and yet around him gathers a strange majesty. Exile does not make him ordinary. It makes him more mysterious. Greek myth often placed the exile at the boundary between human and divine. The banished person could be polluted by crime, yet also chosen by fate. He might be driven out because the city feared contamination, but in wandering he might acquire knowledge unavailable to those who remained safely inside the gates. The exile saw foreign lands, strange customs, remote sanctuaries, and the unprotected edges of human society. He became a witness to what settled, people preferred not to know. Blood guilt was one of the deepest roots of this fear. When kin killed kin, or when murder stained the household, the crime did not remain confined to the guilty mind. It spread through the family, the city, and the land. The Greeks imagined such guilt almost as a dark vapour, an invisible pollution that demanded cleansing. The murderer might need to flee until proper rites could be performed. A city that sheltered the polluted without caution risked divine anger. Crops might fail. Plague might come. Women might miscarry. The gods might turn their faces away. This was not a world in which guilt was only psychological. It was cosmic. The story of Orestes carries this terror with particular force, commanded by divine pressure and trapped by family vengeance. He kills his mother to avenge his father. Justice and horror become inseparable. He has obeyed one sacred demand and violated another. Then come the avenging powers, ancient, relentless, not easily soothed by clever speech. He becomes a fugitive, hunted not only by human accusation, but by beings who embody the memory of blood. His exile is inward as much as outward. Wherever he travels, the crime travels with him. In such myths, the road is never empty. It is crowded with memory. A man may cross seas, climb ridges, pass through cities where no one knows his name, and still remain unable to escape what has happened. Greek exile therefore possessed a double structure. There was the external removal, the visible departure from house and city. Then there was the internal pursuit, the invisible company of guilt, shame, prophecy, or divine command. The exile was outside the walls, but also trapped within a story that would not release him. Kings in myth are especially vulnerable to this fate. Their fall is spectacular because their belonging once seemed absolute. A king's identity is fused with land, throne, palace, and people. When he is driven out, the entire order of the world appears shaken. The royal exile moves through wilderness with the memory of purple cloth, polished halls, bronze weapons, and formal praise. His suffering is sharpened by contrast. Every poor meal recalls banquets. Every insult recalls obedience. Every night under foreign shelter recalls the roof he lost. Yet Greek audiences did not hear these stories simply to pity the fallen. They heard them to contemplate the fragility of all status. The man enthroned today might become the wanderer tomorrow. The house filled with sons might become silent. The city that seemed protected by gods might discover that it has nurtured a curse within its own walls. Exile gave myth a language for sudden reversal. No figure stands forever secure. The Greek word of fate was not a gentle idea. It suggested a portion, an allotment, something measured out. Even the mighty received their share. Exile dramatized the moment when the allotted portion changed. The beloved son became the polluted killer. The saviour became the danger. The king became the beggar. The citizen became the stranger. The road, white beneath the sun, waited for all. There is also an ancient connection between exile and founding. The expelled person does not always vanish. Sometimes he becomes the seed of another order. Greek tradition often imagined cities founded by wanderers, displaced nobles, refugees, or leaders sent out from crowded homelands. The exile's loss could become a beginning elsewhere. Yet this possibility did not soften the terror. It made exile more ambiguous. The banished might be destroyed or transformed. He might die nameless, or return crowned by destiny. He might become the ancestor of another people. This ambiguity made him dangerous in the imagination. A settled city prefers categories: citizen or foreigner, pure or polluted, friend or enemy, lawful or criminal. Exile confuses them all. The banished king may be guilty, but noble. The wanderer may be cursed, but protected by a god. The fugitive may be weak, but destined to found a dynasty. The homeless man at the altar may be a burden, but also a sacred test of hospitality. To reject him might be impious. To receive him might invite war. At the heart of these stories lies the altar of the suppliant, A person in terror could take refuge at a sacred place, touching the altar, clasping the knees of a ruler, lowering the body in a posture of urgent dependence. The suppliant was vulnerable, but not meaningless. He carried religious force. To harm him carelessly could offend the gods. Here the exile became most unsettling. He arrived without power, yet surrounded by sacred danger. His weakness commanded attention. One can almost see such a figure entering a foreign court at dusk. Dust clings to his cloak. His beard is untrimmed. His eyes carry the sleeplessness of long roads. Behind him lie blood, prophecy, or political ruin. Before him stand men who must decide whether compassion will cost them dearly. The torches smoke. Dogs bark in the courtyard. The household pauses. A stranger has arrived, but perhaps not merely a stranger. Perhaps fate itself has entered. Myth taught the Greeks that exile was never a clean solution. To drive someone away was to push a human problem into the wider world, where gods, strangers, enemies, and time might reshape it. The exile could become purified, embittered, sanctified, or monstrous. He could carry pollution outward, or return with the authority of suffering. He could haunt the imagination of those who expelled him, because absence has its own presence. The empty place at the table, the silent doorway, the rumour from another land, all these could keep the banished alive in memory. This is why stories of wandering kings and blood-stained fugitives mattered so deeply. They gave emotional depth to the later legal practices of Greek cities. Law could define banishment in practical terms, but myth had already revealed its spiritual weather. It was storm, drought, ash, and prophecy. It was the lonely road beneath indifferent stars. It was the fear that guilt might cling like smoke. It was the possibility that the one cast out might be carrying either disaster or revelation. Banishment in Greek myth was not an ending, it was a threshold. Beyond it lay madness, purification, new kingdoms, divine encounters, revenge, and silence. A person forced to cross that threshold entered a realm where ordinary protections failed, and deeper powers stirred. The city might close its gates and believe itself safe. But the stories warned otherwise. What is expelled does not always disappear. Sometimes it wanders, sometimes it gathers strength, sometimes it becomes sacred, sometimes it comes home. And in the old tales, beneath the bronze light of heroic memory, the exile walks on with the gods watching from the hills. The most haunting evidence for exile is often not found in grand monuments, but in absence. Archaeology is most comfortable with what remains. A broken cup, a carved decree, a grave stele, a coin darkened by time, a wall line beneath later stones, a layer of ash sealed under collapsed roof tiles. Through stratigraphic excavation, the patient removal of one buried layer after another, the ancient world returns in fragments. Yet exile leaves a more difficult trace. It is the story of someone removed from the place where evidence might have gathered around him. The banished man did not usually leave behind a heroic statue proclaiming his sorrow. He left a gap. A house may continue without him. A workshop may pass into other hands. A field may be cultivated by a rival, a cousin, or the state. His name may vanish from civic lists. His grave may never stand beside the graves of his kin. His children may be recorded elsewhere, if recorded at all. The archaeologist meets not a dramatic ruin, but a silence shaped like a human life. This is the archaeology of absence. Inscriptions help us approach that silence, though they rarely speak with tenderness. Public stone preferred the language of authority. Decrees, boundary markers, property records, treaty clauses, and legal notices were carved to endure. But endurance does not guarantee compassion. A stone might announce confiscation with terrifying calm. It might list penalties. It might name men deprived of rights. It might define who may return and under what conditions. Such texts are cold, exact, and civic. They make exile sound orderly. Behind the carved letters stood fear, packing, weeping, hurried conversations, and the heavy knowledge that ordinary life had been broken. The chisel did not record the smell of a courtyard on the final morning. It did not preserve the voice of a wife asking whether she should remain or follow. It did not capture the sound of servants moving in uncertainty, nor the quick steps of creditors, nor the careful silence of neighbours who did not wish to be seen offering sympathy to a condemned household. The public record gives us the skeleton. The flesh must be imagined carefully, with discipline, humility, and an awareness that still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Sometimes the absence appears in burial. The Greek grave was not merely a disposal of the dead, it was memory made visible. Grave markers along roads outside city walls reminded passers-by of names, families, virtues, and grief. A sculpted figure might show a seated woman reaching toward a child, a warrior holding his equipment, a young man forever strong in stone. These monuments created a continued relationship between the living and the dead. They said, this person belonged somewhere, and someone remembered. The exile risked a different ending. He might die in another land, buried by hosts who did not know the full weight of his name. He might receive proper rites, but not from the hands that mattered most to him. He might leave no marker at all. His body might rest far from the ancestral line, separated not only by distance, but by ritual loss. For a culture so attentive to burial, this possibility carried deep dread. Archaeology rarely finds the words, "Here lies a man who longed for home." Instead, it finds foreign names in unexpected places, grave goods that suggest movement, inscriptions that mention origin, dedications made by people living outside their native cities. A man from one community appears in a sanctuary far away. A family name surfaces in a port known for mercenaries and displaced persons. A dedication to a god is made by someone identifying himself through the city he no longer inhabits. These fragments do not always prove banishment, but they reveal the restless mobility of a Greek world where war, trade, colonization, debt, politics, and punishment scattered people across the sea. Lithic analysis may tell us where stone came from. Ceramic studies may trace the circulation of vessels. Genomic data may reveal patterns of movement across generations. Radiocarbon dating may secure the age of a burial or settlement layer. Yet the emotional cause of movement often remains answerless, adrift to ponder. Was this man a merchant, a soldier, a refugee, a settler, a runaway, or an exile? The material record can point toward displacement, but motive often lies beyond the instrument's reach. This uncertainty should not weaken the story, it should deepen it. The ancient world was not cleanly divided into the settled and the wandering. Ports were full of mixed voices. Mercenary camps gathered men whose homes had failed them, or whom they had failed. Sacred festivals drew visitors from many cities. Wars uprooted populations. Political factions expelled opponents. Aegean waters carried cargo. Rumours and desperate men. The Greek exile moved through this network, sometimes visible, sometimes disguised among other travellers. A cup found far from its place of manufacture does not weep. A coin cannot confess. A broken inscription will not lower its voice and say, "He was afraid." But together, these objects reveal a world in which identity travelled uneasily. A man might introduce himself by naming the city that had cast him out. He might cling to that name because without it he was nothing, even as the city itself refused him. The contradiction is almost unbearably human. The exiled person was absent from home, yet home remained present in him. Public records of return are especially revealing. When cities restored exiles, the language could be formal and controlled, names might be listed, conditions might be set, property might be returned or disputed, oaths might be sworn, amnesty might be proclaimed. Beneath such measures, one senses the difficulty of repairing social reality. A returning exile was not simply a traveller coming back after a long journey. He was a problem re-entering the body that had rejected him. Who now owned his house? Who had harvested his fields? Who had mocked him in his absence? Who had profited from his disgrace? Who had married into his family, taken his clients, occupied his seat at dinner, or spoken against him when he could not answer? Every restored name carried a hidden map of resentment. The archaeological record may preserve the decree, but not the first encounter in the street. Imagine that moment. A man returns through a gate he once believed he would never see again. The stones are familiar, yet altered. Children stare at him without knowing why older people fall silent. A doorway has been repaired. A neighbour has aged. A shrine still smokes. The city smells of bread, animals, dust, olive oil, and rain on limestone. Everything is known. Nothing is simple. There may be no artifact for such an instant, but history must make room for it. The study of exile demands that we read evidence against its own coldness. A list of confiscated properties is also a catalogue of disrupted meals, abandoned rooms, uprooted dependents, and ancestral objects handled by strangers. A grave marker far from home may be a quiet monument to political defeat. A decree allowing return may be the last visible trace of years of hunger, pleading, alliance, and humiliation. A scratched name on pottery may represent not only public judgment, but the beginning of private devastation. The ancient Greeks themselves understood that absence could possess weight. Empty chairs mattered. Unburied bodies mattered. Names unsaid mattered. A person removed from the civic landscape did not become nothing. He became a pressure felt around the edges of speech and memory. For archaeologists and historians, this creates a challenge, both technical and moral. The tools of science can measure, sedate, classify, and compare. Radiocarbon dating can narrow a chronology. Stratigraphic excavation can reveal sequence. Lithic analysis can identify stone sources. Genomic data can trace biological inheritance. These methods anchor us against fantasy. They keep the imagination from drifting too far from the earth. Yet they cannot fully restore the fear in a household when officials came to seize property. They cannot count the nights a child asked whether a father would return. They cannot measure shame. They cannot weigh longing. They cannot reconstruct the exact tone in which an enemy pronounced a banished man's name. Only careful storytelling can approach those shadows, without pretending to own them. And so the archaeology of exile is a discipline of fragments and humility. It asks us to see not only what is present in museums, but what has been removed from the ground of belonging. It asks us to listen to stone without mistaking silence for emptiness. It asks us to treat the vanished not as footnotes, but as people whose lives were torn along lines that law made official and memory made painful. In the scorched landscapes and sea-bright cities of ancient Greece, exile was written not only in decrees, but in missing graves, altered households, scattered names, and the strange loneliness of objects found far from the hands that once used them. The dark truth is that banishment often survives not as a scream, but as a blank space, and blank spaces, when viewed with patience, can be among the most terrible evidence of all. The punishment of exile did not begin at the horizon. It began inside the house, before the road, before the foreign harbour, before the cold bed in a stranger's city. There was the moment when the household understood that its centre had been struck. Banishment was not only movement through space, it was a legal and social unmaking, and often the first victims were the rooms, fields, jars, tools, ledgers, animals, and memories that formed the substance of daily life. To modern eyes, property can appear practical, almost dull. Land, furniture, money, stores of grain, bronze utensils, oil presses, boundary markers, debt records, and inheritance claims. Yet in ancient Greece, property was never merely material. It was honour made visible. It was continuity across generations. It was the proof that a family had endured, worked, married, buried, defended, and belonged. A house did not only shelter bodies, it held the story of a lineage. When exile came with confiscation, that story could be seized. Imagine officials entering a courtyard where the morning meal has barely been cleared away. The doorway still smells of smoke, bread, wool, and damp clay. A loom stands in a shaded corner. Storage jars rest against the wall, their rounded bellies filled with oil or wine. A pair of sandals waits near the threshold. Somewhere inside, a child listens without understanding why adult voices have changed. The law now moves through the rooms like a winter wind. What can be taken from a banished man? Nearly everything that made him stable. His land might be reassigned or sold. His movable goods might be inventoried. His house might be occupied, neglected, or broken apart by claimants. His debts might be called in at the worst possible time. His slaves, animals, and tools might pass into other hands. Sacred family objects might remain physically present. But the hand that once gave offerings was gone. Even if some property remained with relatives, the household had been weakened in the eyes of the community. Its future had become uncertain. This was one reason banishment was feared so deeply. It did not simply remove a person from the city, it made him economically vulnerable in a world where security depended on land, kin, and reputation. A man outside his city could not easily stand in court to defend a boundary. He could not easily confront a dishonest steward. He could not harvest at the proper season. He could not supervise tenants, protect orchards, arrange marriages, pursue debtors, or answer insults in the marketplace. Absence invited invasion. Enemies understood this. The downfall of a citizen was an opportunity for rivals. A political opponent might profit from confiscated estates. A creditor might press a weakened family. A neighbour might move a boundary stone by a few steps, trusting that no powerful voice would challenge him. A distant cousin might suddenly remember an inheritance claim. The city might speak in the language of justice, but private appetites often gathered around public punishment. The exile lost more than ownership. He lost control over the story of ownership. At home, property spoke. A house in a respected quarter, land inherited from a father, a grave enclosure maintained with care, dedications at a local shrine, all these silently proclaimed identity. They told others where a man stood. In exile, these signs were absent. A noble man could appear poor. A once influential citizen could become dependent on borrowed rooms. His old name might open some doors, but without land beneath it, the name sounded thinner. The Greek world was not blind to wealth. Honour had moral language, but it also had material foundations. A man who could outfit a warship, sponsor a chorus, provide sacrifices, lend money, marry advantageously, or feed dependents possessed visible power. Public generosity could become civic glory. The exile, deprived of property, lost the means to perform greatness. Even if he had been brave, eloquent, or well-born, poverty could draw him downward into humiliation. There is a special cruelty in forcing a person to remember abundance while living in dependence. He might once have hosted guests beneath a painted roof. In exile, he waits outside another man's door. He might once have received supplicants. Now he becomes one. He might once have spoken as a citizen among equals. Now he chooses his words carefully, aware that hospitality has limits. A man who had commanded servants may carry his own bundle along a road. A man whose family tomb stood proudly beside a travelled way may wonder whether he will die unnamed beyond a foreign wall. This is why exile has often been described as social death. The phrase is severe, but in the Greek setting it is painfully fitting. The exiled person remained alive in body, yet much of his public identity had been killed. His legal voice was diminished, his social face was altered, his duties could no longer be performed in the same way. His rights were suspended or destroyed. The city continued to exist, but he no longer existed properly within it. The living man became a civic ghost. Social death was not silence. It could be noisy. It might include rumours, mockery, speeches, court cases, property disputes, and family negotiations. His enemies could speak of him freely because he was not present to defend himself. Comic poets might laugh at the disgraced. Political factions might use his name as a warning. Children might grow up hearing a simplified story, stripped of complexity. He was dangerous. He was proud. He betrayed us. He fled. He deserved it. A reputation can be murdered in absentia. This fear gnawed at Exiles with particular force. In a culture where honour depended upon public memory, being unable to answer was agony. A man could endure hunger more easily than slander. He could sleep in a poor room and still remain himself, perhaps. But if his name at home became a curse, then even his inner sense of identity was under siege. The exiled person had to imagine conversations he could not hear, accusations he could not refute, laughter he could not silence. The household bore this burden too. Those who remained behind occupied an awkward and dangerous position. They might be pitied, but pity could contain contempt. They might be watched. Their loyalties might be questioned. A wife managing property in the shadow of a condemned husband might face legal difficulty, social suspicion, and predatory attention. Sons might inherit not only reduced wealth, but a damaged name. Daughters might find marriage negotiations altered by disgrace. Servants might become unreliable. Allies might withdraw. No decree needed to mention all this. Everyone understood. Banishment worked because the city was dense with interdependence. No one lived alone. Food, credit, labour, marriage, military service, burial, worship, and law-connected citizens through countless visible and invisible bonds. To cut a man from that network was to cause practical pain in every direction. The exile might be the named target, but punishment radiated outward like cracks in fired clay. Even objects became painful. A cup left on a shelf, a cloak folded in a chest, a walking staff leaning in a corner, a seal used on documents, a child's memory of a father's hand at a festival. These items could become small altars of absence. If the house was confiscated, strangers might handle them without reverence. If the family remained, the objects might stay exactly where they were, which could be worse. Each familiar thing became a witness to interruption. The Greeks understood the emotional life of objects more deeply than they are sometimes given credit for. Gifts carried relationships. Armour carried honour. Household goods carried labour. Ancestral property carried duty. To strip a family of possessions was not merely economic injury. It was an assault upon continuity. There was also a sacred dimension to ownership. Land contained graves. Fields held boundary stones. Houses held hearths. Offerings made over generations attached piety to place. A confiscated estate was not only a financial asset changing hands, it was a spiritual landscape disturbed. Who would honour the family dead? Who would maintain the rights? Who would speak the names? The exile's loss extended downward into the earth, and yet, from the city's point of view, confiscation had purpose. It weakened enemies. It funded public needs. It displayed authority. It warned others. It made punishment visible in the very streets. A man might be gone, but the sale of his goods, the redistribution of his land, or the occupation of his house reminded everyone what power the civic body possessed. Exile turned private ruin into public instruction. That instruction was deliberately chilling. The city did not always need chains when it could threaten belonging. It did not always need execution when it could break the bridge between a man and his inheritance. It did not always need to erase a body when it could erase a household's future. In this way, banishment operated with dreadful sophistication. It punished the present and reached into the years yet unborn. For the one exiled, every rumour from home mattered. Was the vineyard still kept? Had the roof collapsed? Had an enemy purchased the fields? Did the children eat well? Was the wife safe? Had the grave offerings continued? Did anyone still speak his name with respect? Such questions could torment a man more cruelly than the physical hardships of travel. A person may cross many miles and still remain trapped inside the rooms he lost. The dark truth of ancient Greek exile is that the road was only the visible part. Beneath it lay a deeper devastation, property taken, identity weakened, family exposed, and memory contested. Banishment feared the body enough to move it away, but it feared the person more completely by attacking the supports that made life coherent. The exile did not simply leave his house. The house was made to leave him. Behind the public sentence of exile stood the quieter suffering of those who were not always named. Ancient Greek law, history, and political memory often placed men at the centre of banishment. The man was condemned. The man was expelled. The man lost property, rights, office, honour, and place. His name appeared in speeches, decrees, accusations, and stories. Yet around him stood a household of other lives, less visible in the record but no less wounded by the sentence. Wives, daughters, sons, mothers, sisters, servants, dependents, and unborn descendants could all feel the blow of a punishment officially aimed at one person. The city might exile a man, but the household absorbed the shock. Women in ancient Greek cities lived within social structures that gave them fewer public instruments of defence. Their honour was tied closely to family reputation, marriage alliances, household management, fertility, and the perceived order of domestic life. When a husband, father, brother, or son fell under the shadow of banishment, that shadow could spread across the women attached to him. They had not stood in the assembly. They had not commanded troops. They had not carved policy from public speech. Still, their futures might bend beneath the weight of a sentence they did not pronounce and could not prevent. Imagine a wife at the centre of an unsettled house. Her husband has been ordered away. The courtyard that once held routine now holds tension. Storage jars must be counted. Keys must be guarded. Messengers come and go. Relatives offer advice, some sincere, some self-serving. Friends become careful. Enemies become attentive. Every decision carries risk. Should she follow him into uncertainty, leaving behind the social world that gave her protection? Should she remain, managing a damaged household beneath watchful eyes? Should she send children away, or keep them near? No answer is safe. The Greeks valued female modesty and domestic order, but exile shattered domestic order at its foundations. A woman whose male guardian was banished might become legally and socially vulnerable. Property disputes could become harder to resist. Marriage negotiations might falter. Household servants might test boundaries. Male relatives might step in, not always from kindness. The home could become a contested space where authority was unclear and survival required tact, endurance, and silence. Silence is one of the great problems in recovering the lives of women affected by exile. Public documents rarely pause to describe their fear. Historians name them only when dynasty, scandal, or exceptional tragedy demands it. Inscriptions may preserve their relationships, but not their voices. The absence is not evidence that they suffered less. It is evidence that the ancient record often looked away. For daughters, exile could damage the fragile mathematics of marriage. A girl's prospects depended on family status, dowry, reputation, alliances, and the trust of other households. If her father was banished as dangerous, polluted, disgraced, or politically defeated, the stain could alter how other families viewed her. Even when no formal dishonour attached to her, practical fear remained. Who wanted to marry into a house whose property might be disputed? Who wanted an alliance with a family watched by the city? Who wanted sons connected to a fallen name? Marriage in such a world was not only romance, nor even primarily romance. It was continuity, property, legitimacy, and alliance. When exile cracked the father's standing, it cracked the daughter's path into the future. Sons faced a different burden. They inherited memory like a second body. A boy whose father had been banished might grow beneath a name spoken with unease, at school, in training, at festivals, in the gymnasium, among older men. He could feel the invisible mark. Some might pity him, others might test him. Still others might expect him to carry his father's political loyalties, whether he wished to or not. His youth could be haunted by a story formed before he had power to shape it. A son might worship his absent father, imagining him noble and wronged. He might resent him for bringing ruin upon the household. He might vow revenge. He might seek reconciliation with the city. He might try to bury the old name beneath careful obedience. Each path carried pain. To be the child of an exile was to live between inheritance and suspicion. For younger children, the wound could be more intimate. They might remember not political speeches, but gestures, a hand guiding them through a festival crowd, a voice at the doorway, a seat at the meal, a smell of cloak, leather, oil, and dust. Then the person disappears, not into death, where rituals give shape to grief, but into distance. The absent parent is alive somewhere, perhaps hungry, perhaps honoured elsewhere, perhaps planning return, perhaps slowly fading. This is a peculiar sorrow. It cannot mourn completely because it cannot know completely. The household of an exile lived with unfinished grief. Mothers of banished men suffered another ancient sorrow, the reversal of the natural order of protection. A mother who had once carried, fed, and watched over a son might see him driven beyond her reach by civic command. She could not follow easily. She could not defend him publicly in most circumstances. She might hear accusations against him in the city, and know that the child she remembered had become, in public language, a threat. Between maternal memory and civic judgment lay a deep and lonely gulf. The emotional voice of Greek tragedy understood such wounds, even when civic documents did not. Again and again. The stage filled with mothers pleading, daughters lamenting, wives confronting ruin, and children bearing the cost of male violence, ambition, or fate. The theatre gave voice to the domestic aftershock of public catastrophe. It showed that the fall of a man rarely stopped with him. The house groaned, the women wailed, the children inherited ash. Exile also endangered the practical labour by which households survived. Women supervised food stores, textile production, servants, children, and ritual duties within the home. Their work kept the family functioning. When property was confiscated or income disrupted, their burdens increased. The same hands that prepared offerings might now stretch grain. The same woman who once arranged household order might negotiate scarcity, debt, and fear. Poverty entered not as an abstract condition, but as thinner meals, patched clothing, delayed marriages, and anxious nights. Servants and enslaved people also stood in the blast radius. Their lives were bound to the household's fate. If property was seized, they might be sold, transferred, separated from familiar people, or dragged into the exile's journey. They appear least in the moral imagination of elite sources. Yet their instability must have been acute. For them, banishment of a master could mean a new owner, a harsher life, or movement across sea and land without any voice in the matter. The city's decision reached even those who had no citizenship to lose. This is one of the darker layers of ancient punishment. Law names the guilty, but suffering spreads through dependency. A public sentence enters kitchens, storerooms, sleeping spaces, women's quarters, children's games, servant routines, and marriage beds. It changes how people knock at the door. It changes who speaks openly. It changes whether laughter feels safe. It changes how a family sits at night when lamps burn low, and every sound in the street seems meaningful. For women who followed an exile, another world opened. The journey itself could be dangerous. Roads, ships, foreign households, uncertain income, loss of female networks, and dependence on hospitality outside the protections of birth community. A woman who had known her place within one city might become a stranger among strangers, judged by accent, clothing, poverty, or rumour. She might remain loyal and still feel anger. She might preserve household rites with improvised means, lighting a small flame in a foreign room while remembering the hearth she left behind. For women who stayed, the pain was no smaller, only different. Remaining could mean survival, protection of children, and defence of property. It could also mean suspicion from both sides, loyal to the absent man, yet living under the power of those who condemned him, present in the city, yet not fully trusted, bound to a household whose head was elsewhere. Every public appearance demanded restraint. Ancient exile thus created a cruel geography of separation, husband from wife, father from child, son from mother, graves from descendants, household from name. The road did not carry one person alone. It stretched invisibly through all who loved, depended on, feared, or were connected to him. An inherited disgrace could last longer than the sentence itself. A man might return, but children would remember hunger. Property might be restored, but neighbours would remember weakness. A daughter might marry, but whispers could follow. A son might enter public life, but opponents could awaken the old story when useful. The household could sweep the floor, repair the roof, refill the storerooms, and resume sacrifices. Yet something delicate had been altered. Trust, once broken, is not easily recarved into its former shape. The fear of exile was therefore not simply the fear of personal suffering. It was the fear of becoming the cause of suffering in others. A citizen knew that his fall could pull down those sheltered beneath his roof. His political defeat could become his daughter's uncertainty, his son's bitterness, his wife's humiliation, his mother's grief, his servant's displacement, his ancestors' neglected rights. The sentence was singular. The pain was plural. This is why the silent figures matter. They remind us that ancient banishment was not a clean line drawn around one guilty body. It was a widening circle. It entered the parts of life that official speech often leaves unnamed. It lived in the lowered voice of a wife at the doorway, the clenched jaw of a son in the training ground, the anxious calculation of a daughter's marriage, the old mother listening for footsteps that would not come, and the child who still expected a familiar figure to return at dusk. The city could call exile a political necessity. It could call it mercy. It could call it purification. It could call it defence. Inside the household, it was known by another name. It was the long breaking of the people left behind. The banished did not always fade into poverty, prayer, and silence. Some became more dangerous once the city had cast them out. The Greek world was a landscape of rival cities, shifting alliances, mountain passes, island harbours, hired soldiers, ambitious rulers, and courts where a desperate man with knowledge could still find value. Exile could strip a citizen of place, but it did not strip him of memory. He knew gates, factions, family quarrels, harbour depths, treasury habits, grain routes, defensive weaknesses, and the private resentments of men still inside the walls. To an enemy, such knowledge could be worth silver. To a tyrant, it could be worth a throne. So the exile walked away carrying a map. Not always a map drawn on parchment, but a living map of loyalties, injuries, and opportunities. He knew which aristocratic houses hated one another. He knew which general had been insulted. He knew which festival drew guards away from a certain road. He knew which village might open its doors in secret if promised restoration. He knew how fear moved through his own city because he had once belonged to it. That belonging, severed by law, could become a weapon. This was one of the paradoxes of banishment. A city expelled a man to make itself safer, yet in doing so it sometimes created an enemy who knew it intimately. The Greek exile often entered the world of the mercenary. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from Sicily to Asia Minor, from Egypt to the inner territories of powerful kings, Greek soldiers sold their skill to those who could pay. They brought shield, spear, training, discipline, and hunger for fortune. Some were younger sons without inheritance. Some were adventurers. Some were displaced by war. Some were men whose political defeat had made peaceful civic life impossible. In such camps, the exiled citizen could find food, pay, comradeship, and a new form of identity. The campfire became a substitute for the hearth. One can imagine them at night on foreign soil, bronze helmets set beside bedrolls, spears stacked upright, smoke moving low through the dark, men from many cities speaking in familiar tongues, but with different accents and old grudges buried beneath necessity. Around them stood a world not governed by the laws of home, but by paymasters, captains, and survival. The exile who had once argued in the assembly now listened for orders beneath a foreign sky. Mercenary life could harden him. It taught patience, violence, and calculation. It placed him in contact with powerful patrons. It turned grievance into military usefulness. A banished noble who could gather companions was not merely a refugee. He was a potential commander, a claimant, a bargaining piece in wider conflict. His dream of return might be private, but others could use it. Tyrants understood this very well. In many Greek cities, political power was not stable for long. Oligarchs struggled with democrats. Great families plotted against rivals. Popular leaders rose and fell. Foreign intervention could overturn local arrangements. In such conditions, exiles became valuable instruments. A ruler seeking influence over another city might shelter its expelled faction. He might feed them, arm them, flatter them, and wait. They were human tinder. When conditions changed, they could be sent back across the border to ignite revolt. To receive exiles was therefore both an act of hospitality and a form of strategy. A court could become a warehouse of displaced ambition. Men who had lost their city gathered around a ruler's table, each carrying a story of injustice, each claiming supporters at home, each promising that with money, ships, or soldiers he could open the way. Some were sincere, some exaggerated, some had no chance at all. But desperation is persuasive when dressed in noble grievance. The exiled man learned to speak of restoration, as though it were not only his desire, but destiny. This made him dangerous to himself as well, for exile feeds the imagination. A man far from home may polish memory until it shines falsely. Every insult becomes unforgivable. Every former ally becomes either loyal or treacherous. Every political defeat becomes betrayal. The city he lost may grow more beautiful in absence, even if he once cursed its factions and dust, or it may become monstrous in his mind, an ungrateful beast that must be punished. The longer he waits, the more return can become not a hope, but an obsession. Some exiles became conspirators. They sent letters in secret. They bribed guards. They approached dissatisfied citizens. They promised foreign backing. They appealed to kinship, class resentment, democratic outrage, aristocratic pride, or religious grievance, depending on what would open doors. Their absence did not make them politically dead. It gave them a hidden life, moving through messengers, oaths, and whispered plans. The city, knowing this, watched the horizon. There was always a fear that those beyond the frontier had not accepted defeat. A ship in the harbour might be carrying traders, or it might be carrying men with old names and sharpened plans. A rumour from a neighbouring city might mean nothing, or it might mean an exiled faction had found support. A festival crowd might conceal sympathisers, a night gate might be opened from within. Banishment created a border, but borders are never perfect. The return of exiles could be sudden and violent. A group of expelled men, armed and supported by outside forces, might seize a strong point, call on friends, promise forgiveness to some, death to others, and forced the city into crisis. In other cases, return came through negotiated settlement, but even then violence hovered near. Each returning exile carried memory of loss. Each opponent remembered why he had been expelled. The city became a room filled with men who knew too much about one another's fear. Greek political life was haunted by this cycle. Faction, expulsion, exile, alliance, return, revenge, renewed faction. In this cycle, banishment ceased to be an endpoint. It became one phase in a longer contest. The loser left the city, but not the game. His move shifted to another board, another harbour, another ruler's court, another battlefield. The city might sleep more easily for a season, but its exiles slept lightly too, dreaming of gates, assemblies, property, and vengeance. The figure of the dangerous returnee became part of the ancient imagination. He was no longer merely pitiable. He was weather-gathering beyond the hills. He had suffered hunger and humiliation, perhaps fought in foreign wars, perhaps learned new methods of command, perhaps won the loyalty of men who cared nothing for his city except as a place to plunder. The citizen who left with tears might return with soldiers. This fear gave exiles a strange power even when they had little money. Their possibility mattered. A city did not need to see them at the walls to feel their pressure. Political enemies at home could be accused of sympathy with them. Public debates could be shaped by fear of their return. Laws could be hardened. Oaths could be demanded. Property settlements could be delayed. The absent became a presence in every tense decision. Some exiles understood the art of waiting. They did not rush. They watched wars, harvest failures, succession struggles, unpopular taxes, military defeats, and foreign invasions. A city confident in peace might ignore them. A city weakened by hunger or defeat might suddenly remember that a banished faction still had friends. In the Greek world, time itself could become an ally of the dispossessed. Yet the life of the armed exile was not romantic. It was precarious, morally corrosive, and often brutal. A man seeking restoration through foreign support might become dependent on those who cared nothing for his homeland's freedom. He might promise too much. He might return not as saviour, but as instrument. He might discover that the soldiers who brought him home expected payment in plunder, privilege, or submission. The road back could be paved with compromises that made the old injury darker. This is one reason Greeks feared exile as a political force. It blurred the boundary between victim and threat. The banished man might truly have been wronged. He might also become ruthless. He might seek justice, then slide into revenge. He might tell himself that any alliance was justified by the crime committed against him. He might invite foreign power into Greek quarrels and call it necessity. In his heart, he might still love the city. With his actions, he might endanger it. Such contradictions were not rare. They were central to the tragedy of exile. The mercenary, the tyrant's guest, the conspirator, the claimant, the returnee, all belong to the same dark family of displacement. These figures remind us that banishment was not only a punishment inflicted by settled order upon disorderly individuals, it was also a creator of new disorder. It produced men without easy restraint, men whose old obligations had been cut, and whose new loyalties were conditional. It turned citizens into wanderers, and wanderers into weapons. Across the ancient Greek seas, under red dawns and moonlit rigging, such men travelled with their hopes hidden beneath cloaks. They stood in foreign marketplaces listening for news. They drank with soldiers who asked no questions. They knelt before rulers they would once have despised. They practiced speeches of return in their minds. They remembered every doorway, every insult, every field, every face. The city had banished them to escape danger. Yet danger had learned to live outside the walls. Beyond the Aegean, beyond the broken glitter of island harbours and the familiar rivalries of Greek cities, there rose an empire so vast that Greek imagination often struggled to contain it. Its roads ran across mountains and deserts. Its kings commanded peoples whose languages, clothing, gods, and customs filled the world with bewildering variety. Its wealth seemed almost beyond measure. Its armies could darken plains. Its messengers rode through dust and heat beneath royal command. To the Greeks, this eastern power was not merely a foreign kingdom. It was a shadow at the edge of political thought. Persia changed the meaning of exile. A Greek man driven from his city might once have sought shelter among neighbouring communities, kin groups, sacred sanctuaries, or rival factions. But when Persian power entered Greek affairs, exile became entangled with empire. The banished citizen was no longer only a displaced man. He could become an advisor to the great king, a guide through Greek politics, a broker of alliances, or a symbol of betrayal. The road of exile now led not only into poverty or wandering, but into palaces where foreign rulers listened with careful interest. This possibility terrified Greek cities. The Persian court could offer what many exiles lacked: protection, money, prestige, and the hope of return. A man stripped of influence at home might recover importance in imperial service. The exile who had been rejected by his own citizens might find himself questioned by satraps, honoured by commanders, or granted land by a king whose resources dwarfed those of any single Greek city. Such favour could feel like rescue. It could also become a chain. For the Greek imagination, Persia was both magnificent and morally dangerous. Its courts suggested luxury, softness, obedience, splendour, and hierarchy. Greek political identity, especially in cities proud of citizen debate, often defined itself against the idea of submission to a monarch, yet hardship weakens old certainties. A hungry exile at a foreign court might speak differently than a proud citizen in a crowded assembly. Men who had once praised civic freedom could find themselves bowing for survival, calculation, or revenge. The dark truth is that exile could turn patriotism into negotiation. Consider the atmosphere of a Persian provincial court. The floors bright with woven carpets, servants moving silently, incense thick in the air, men in rich garments speaking through interpreters, seals pressed into clay, silver counted, letters dispatched across territories that would take a Greek weeks to cross. Into this world comes the exile, perhaps still wearing the plain cloak of his homeland, perhaps already altered by necessity. He carries no army of his own. What he carries is knowledge. He can explain which Greek cities fear one another. He can name men willing to betray democratic leaders or aristocratic councils. He can describe harbours where ships may anchor, roads where armies may march, islands where supplies may be gathered. He can tell the Persians when a treaty is hollow, when a faction is desperate, when a proud city is weaker than it appears. His exile has made him useful. Greek cities knew this and dreaded it. A banished man at the Persian court became a living breach in the walls of memory and strategy. He might reveal too much. He might exaggerate his influence to secure royal favour. He might promise that if restored, he would guide his city toward alliance. He might claim to speak for silent supporters at home. Whether truthful or not, his words could affect imperial policy. A single displaced citizen could help draw a powerful empire into local Greek conflicts. This was one reason exile carried the odour of treachery even when the original sentence had been unjust. Once a man accepted foreign shelter, every action became suspect. Was he surviving or betraying? Was he seeking justice or selling his city's secrets? Was he a victim of faction or a willing servant of an enemy? The boundary could blur until even the exile himself may not have known where necessity ended and dishonour began. The Persian shadow made the banished Greek politically radioactive. At home, enemies could use foreign association as proof of corruption. Even if the exile had no army, even if he merely lived under distant protection, rumour could do the work of accusation. He eats Persian bread, he waits on barbarian favour, he plots with the king. Such phrases could stain a name for generations. In a world where public honour mattered fiercely, the charge of serving outsiders could be devastating. Yet Greek cities were not innocent in this game. They too sought Persian money when useful. They negotiated, made treaties, requested aid, and accepted support in their own struggles. The moral line between patriotic resistance and practical diplomacy shifted with circumstance. What was unforgivable when done by an enemy might be called wise policy when done by one's own faction. Exiles exposed this hypocrisy because their personal desperation mirrored the wider Greek dependence on larger powers. The figure of the exile in Persian service therefore reveals a larger truth. Greek freedom was never lived in isolation. It existed beside empires. Trade routes, war funds, grain supplies, naval coalitions, tribute, and fear. The city might speak of autonomy, but its exiles knew how porous autonomy could be. A man cast out from a small civic world might enter a larger system where cities became pieces in imperial calculation. For the exile, Persia could feel like enlargement. The scale alone must have been overwhelming. A man from a rocky Greek landscape, accustomed to fierce local identities and limited civic territory, might encounter the administrative breadth of empire with awe. Royal roads, storehouses, tribute, multilingual officials, vast estates, and armies drawn from many peoples revealed another form of power. Greek civic belonging had been intimate, face-to-face, and often cruel. Persian power was distant, immense and formal. Such distance could be seductive. At home, the exile had been judged by neighbours who knew every family quarrel. Abroad, he could reinvent himself as an expert, envoy, commander, or honoured guest. He could convert disgrace into usefulness. He could tell his story in a way that made him heroic. The foreign court lacked the full memory of his shame. It cared less about old gossip and more about future advantage. This gave the exile room to breathe, but also tempted him towards self-deception. A man who's lost his audience will search for another. Still, imperial favour was never secure. The exile at a powerful court was dependent on interest. If his knowledge became outdated, if his promises failed, if political winds changed, he might be abandoned. The king's generosity was not friendship. The satrap's welcome was not kinship. The banquet was not a hearth. Beneath luxury lay vulnerability. The exile had traded the dangerous intimacy of the city for the dangerous distance of empire. Greek stories and political memories often treated such men with fascination and unease. They stood between worlds. They knew the speech of citizens and the customs of courts. They could advise enemies because they understood friends. They could become bridges, but also cracks. Their bodies were Greek, their resentments local, their patrons foreign, their ambitions unstable. They seemed to prove that exile could loosen the moral bonds that held a person to his city. That fear was not purely imagined. A city depends on confidence that its citizens, even when angry, remain bound to it. Exile tests that bond to breaking. If the city says, "You are no longer one of us," then what loyalty remains? If it seizes property, shames family, and drives a man into danger, can it still demand silence from him? The Greeks feared the answer because it was not simple. The banished man may owe the city nothing, yet the city may remain in his blood. This contradiction made exile morally unbearable. The man in Persian service might sit beneath painted beams, eating at a table far richer than any he knew at home, while still dreaming of a narrow street, a family tomb, a childhood shrine, a particular slope in evening light. He might advise foreign power against the city and still feel pain at its suffering. He might call his actions justice while knowing they resembled betrayal. He might hope to return with honour, yet suspect that return by foreign help would poison honour at its root. Empires are skilled at using broken loyalties. They do not need to invent every division. They wait for smaller worlds to wound their own people. They listen to the expelled, the humiliated, the ambitious, the frightened, and the dispossessed. They turn memory into intelligence, grievance into policy, and exile into leverage. In the Greek world, the Persian court became one of the great stages upon which this transformation could occur. This is why banishment was feared not only by the condemned, but by the condemning city. Every exile might become a messenger to powers beyond the horizon. Every confiscated estate might become an argument for revenge. Every public humiliation might become a private offer whispered in a foreign chamber. The city could close its gates, but it could not close the world, and the world was listening. Under the vast eastern sky, where royal fires burned in palaces unknown to most Greeks, the banished man discovered that his loss had value. He had been made homeless, but not useless. He had been rejected, but not silenced. He had been severed from the city, yet could still wound it from afar. That was the Persian shadow. It taught Greek cities that exile didn't end at the frontier. It travelled into empire, dressed itself in foreign favour, learned the language of opportunity, and waited among those who understood that a broken citizen could become a powerful instrument. Exile did not only trouble armies, households, and courts, it also entered the mind. Among the Greeks, banishment became one of the great tests of philosophy because it forced a question that no city could fully answer. What remains of a human being when public status is stripped away? If a man loses his home, his rights, his property, his audience, his political voice, and the daily recognition of his neighbours, does he lose himself? Or is there something within him that no decree can reach? This question moved through the ancient world like a lamp carried through a long corridor. Greek philosophy was born among cities, yet it often challenged the city's power to define the soul. Philosophers walked through marketplaces, taught in gymnasiums, argued in shaded colonnades, and addressed citizens whose lives were shaped by law, honour, and public reputation. They did not speak from nowhere. They spoke inside civic life. Yet many of them looked past civic life toward a deeper measure of worth. The philosopher, in this sense, was always close to exile. He might live among citizens and still seem foreign. He might obey the laws and still ask questions that made law uncomfortable. He might share in festivals, military service, and public rituals, while insisting that truth did not bend simply because the crowd voted. In a culture where belonging was sacred, the philosopher could become a troubling figure because he belonged and did not belong at the same time. No figure embodies this tension more powerfully than Socrates. He was not, in the ordinary sense, an exile. He did not flee Athens when his life was in danger, yet the possibility of exile hovered over his final days like a shadow at the edge of the room. When he was condemned, alternatives existed in imagination and discussion. He might have escaped. He might have gone elsewhere. Friends were ready. Other cities might have received him. The road out of Athens was not impossible. He refused it. That refusal has echoed for centuries because it transformed exile from a practical option into a philosophical revelation. For Socrates, life away from Athens under certain conditions was not salvation. It might have meant abandoning the whole pattern of inquiry, obedience, argument, and civic tension that had shaped his soul. He had spent his life questioning his fellow citizens in the streets of his own city. To depart as a fugitive would have raised a terrible contradiction. Could he still claim to honour the laws if he escaped their sentence? Could he still examine life truthfully if he preserved his body by betraying his principles? The cup of poison became more famous than the road not taken. Here exile appears not as mercy, but as moral dislocation. Socrates seemed to suggest that survival without integrity could be a poorer thing than death. Yet the question remains answerless, adrift to ponder. Was he right to stay? Was the city right to condemn him? Was obedience to law noble when law had acted unjustly? The power of his story lies in the fact that it does not settle easily. It leaves the listener awake in the darkness. To many later thinkers, exile became a stage on which virtue proved itself. A person who relied entirely on wealth, applause, office, and citizenship could be destroyed by banishment. But a person who cultivated wisdom, moderation, courage, and self-command might remain free even in foreign lands. This idea did not erase suffering. Hunger was real. Loneliness was real. The loss of family graves was real. But philosophy asked whether suffering had the final authority over the inner life. Some schools of thought pushed this question with severe brilliance. The cynics, with their rough cloaks, biting wit and contempt for luxury, treated social convention as a fragile costume. If a person could train himself to need little, then exile lost some of its terror. What is a city to the one who has learned to live under the open sky? What is disgrace to the one who laughs at false honour? Such ideas shocked respectable citizens because they attack the roots of ordinary ambition. They suggested that the city's greatest weapon, social exclusion, might fail against a person who refused to worship social approval. Yet there is both courage and danger in such defiance. Few people can live as if they need no one. The cynic posture could reveal the vanity of wealth, but it could also sound cruel to those whose families truly depended on civic protection. Philosophy might transform exile into a lesson, but the body still required food, shelter, and safety. A child could not be fed with arguments against convention. A grieving mother could not be warmed by clever contempt for reputation. The Stoics later gave exile another meaning. To them, the universe itself could be understood as a greater city, ordered by reason. A person's true homeland was not merely the place of birth, but the rational whole to which all human beings belonged. This vision had immense power. It widened the imagination beyond local walls. It suggested that no city could fully own a human soul, because the soul belonged first to truth, virtue, and nature. Such thinking was a quiet revolution. For a Greek citizen trained to locate identity in the city, the idea of a larger moral citizenship altered the terror of banishment. If the cosmos is one ordered community, then the exile has not been cast into nothing. He has been moved from one district of the human condition to another. He may be far from his ancestral hearth, but not outside the reach of reason. He may lose office, but not virtue. He may lose applause, but not the capacity to judge rightly. Still, even the loftiest philosophy could not entirely conquer longing. The philosopher might say that the wise person carries home within, yet the scent of familiar rain, the sound of a native dialect, the sight of a childhood hill at evening, the touch of a threshold worn by generations. These are not illusions easily dismissed. Human beings are not pure arguments. They are memory, flesh, habit, voice, and place. Ancient moralists knew this, even when they preached endurance. Their teaching sought not to deny pain, but to keep pain from becoming slavery. Exile forced philosophy to distinguish between what can be taken and what cannot. The city can take property. It can remove a name from public honour. It can separate a person from temples, festivals, office, and familiar streets. It can confiscate fields and silence a voice in assembly. But can it take justice from the just person? Can it take wisdom from the wise? Can it take courage from the courageous? Can it take the discipline by which a person refuses to become inwardly ruined by outward disaster? These questions gave exile a strange spiritual intensity. The banished philosopher became a figure both wounded and free. He had lost the ordinary supports of identity, yet his condition revealed the weakness of those supports. Citizens still inside the walls might envy wealth, fear rumour, flatter the powerful, and tremble before public opinion. The exile, stripped of much, might see more clearly. He might learn which friendships were real. He might discover which desires had enslaved him. He might understand that the crowd's judgment, though painful, was not the voice of truth itself. There was a harsh beauty in this. A person cast out from the city could become a witness against the city's arrogance. His suffering exposed the limits of political power. The city could define membership, but not ultimate value. It could expel the body, but not necessarily command the conscience. It could turn a citizen into a stranger, but it could not always prevent that stranger from becoming morally greater in exile than his judges had been in comfort. Yet philosophy also understood another danger. Exile could deform the soul. Not every banished person became wise. Some became bitter, servile, reckless, or consumed by revenge. Hardship does not automatically purify. It can narrow the mind, harden the heart, and make grievance into an idol. The same road that teaches humility to one person teaches cruelty to another. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made in the silent ruins of individual lives, where no inscription records whether suffering enlarged or diminished the spirit. In this way, exile became a test rather than a single meaning. For the proud, it could be humiliation; for the corrupt, exposure; for the reflective, instruction; for the innocent, tragedy; for the philosopher, it became an experiment conducted upon the self. Remove the city, remove the applause, remove the visible rank, and see what remains standing. What remains may be very little, or it may be the beginning of wisdom. The ancient Greeks feared banishment because they loved the city with sacred intensity, yet their philosophers dared to ask whether human dignity might exceed the city's embrace. They did not make exile painless. They did not turn the road into a garden. They did not pretend that foreign bread tasted like home, but they opened a space in which the banished person could look inward and ask whether the deepest homeland was not made of walls, but of character. Under the quiet evening light of the Mediterranean, one can imagine such a figure walking slowly beyond familiar territory. Behind him lies judgment, around him lies uncertainty, ahead lies no guarantee, yet within him, perhaps, burns a small and disciplined flame. Not the hearth of his fathers, not the altar of the city, but something harder to extinguish, a conscience still awake. And in that lonely flame, Greek philosophy found one of its most enduring answers to exile. The city may close its gates, but the soul, if rightly ordered, need not become homeless. There were moments in the Greek world when exile ceased to be the fate of a single man and became the language of a city tearing itself apart. Civil war was the furnace in which banishment changed its face. In calmer times, exile could be described as restraint, a measured penalty, a means of removing danger without filling the streets with blood. But when faction devoured the city, when neighbours armed themselves against neighbours, when old grudges found political names, banishment became something colder and more systematic. It became a method of civic cleansing. The Greeks knew this terror intimately. Their cities were small enough for hatred to be personal and political at the same time. Men who argued about constitutions also knew one another's fathers. Families who disputed public policy might share festival memories, marriage ties, business dealings and boundary quarrels. A political enemy was rarely an abstraction. He was a face in the marketplace, a voice in the council, a house across the lane, a rival at sacrifice, a man whose children were known to your children. When civil conflict came, this intimacy made cruelty sharper. The struggle between democracy and oligarchy was not merely an argument about procedure. It was a struggle over who counted, who ruled, who owned, who judged, who commanded, and who could safely remain inside the walls. Words that had once belonged to constitutional debate became weapons. One side spoke of liberty, the other of order. One side spoke of equality, the other of excellence. Yet beneath noble language moved fear of revenge, fear of confiscation, fear of humiliation, fear that losing power meant losing everything. In such a climate, exile became a mass condition. A victorious faction might drive out its opponents not because each had committed a specific crime, but because their existence seemed dangerous. Too many old enemies in the streets meant conspiracy. Too many defeated rivals in the assembly meant future reversal. Too many families loyal to the wrong cause meant the city would never rest. So names were listed, houses were seized, roads filled with the defeated. The city purified itself by expelling a portion of its own memory. But this purification was never clean. The exiled carried the city with them. They knew its weak points. They had relatives inside. They had property claims, sacred obligations, and buried anger. They gathered beyond the frontier, not as isolated sufferers, but as a second city in waiting, camped in nearby territories, sheltered by allies, or scattered among sympathetic powers. They became a living accusation against the regime that expelled them. Every decision made by the victors had to consider the possibility of their return. Civil war made absence militant. The exiled no longer stood simply as mournful figures in foreign dust. They became organized communities of grievance. They held meetings. They chose leaders. They sent messengers. They preserved internal hierarchies. They remembered who had remained loyal, who had betrayed them, who had profited from confiscated property, who had mocked their departure. Their suffering became a political archive. Nothing was forgotten, because memory was the fuel of return. Inside the city, those who remained lived under the pressure of suspicion. A man might be accused of corresponding with exiles. A family might be watched because a son, uncle, or brother had fled. A neutral citizen might be forced to declare loyalty more loudly than his conscience allowed. Private grief became public danger. Even mourning could look like treason if the dead or absent belonged to the defeated side. This is the darkness of factional exile. It criminalized affection. A mother grieving for an expelled son might be seen as disloyal. A friend sending money might be accused of conspiracy. A wife preserving property for a husband abroad might be watched as a threat to the new order. The city that once depended upon kinship, friendship, and sacred duty now treated those same bonds as hidden channels of rebellion. Civil war turned the ordinary kindnesses of life into suspicious acts. Fear altered language itself. The Greeks were acutely aware that civil strife corrupts words. Courage could be called recklessness. Caution could be called cowardice. Moderation could be called betrayal. Cruelty could be praised as firmness. Treachery could wear the mask of civic necessity. Exile participated in this corruption. To drive out enemies could be called saving the city. To seize their property could be called justice. To silence their families could be called security. Beneath these words lay the raw fact that one group had made another group homeless. Mass banishment was rarely only about safety. It was also about revenge and wealth. When a faction triumphed, confiscated estates could reward supporters and punish opponents at once. Public ideology and private appetite joined hands. A citizen might shout for democracy or oligarchy while eyeing a rival's vineyard. A leader might speak of cleansing corruption while distributing houses to followers. Political language gave moral cover to material hunger. The exile's loss became another man's advancement. This fed the cycle. The dispossessed did not forget who slept beneath their roofs. The man eating from their storerooms became an enemy in the deepest sense. Political disagreement became household violation. A return was not imagined merely as restoration of rights. It was imagined as a reckoning in courtyards, fields, and streets. Thus, every confiscation planted future violence, and every banishment created a ledger of revenge. The city became trapped between two terrors. If it allowed defeated enemies to remain, it feared internal conspiracy. If it expelled them, it created an external threat. If it confiscated property, it rewarded allies but deepened hatred. If it showed mercy, it risked appearing weak. If it showed severity, it made reconciliation harder. Civil war placed the city inside a maze where every path led through fear, and the ordinary people suffered most from this instability. Farmers could not know whether a field would remain theirs if power changed. Traders did not know whose coins or promises would matter in a month. Families arranged marriages with caution, fearful that alliance with one faction might become disaster under another. Young men were pulled toward militias, guard duty, raids, or exile bands. Old men remembered better seasons and watched the city devour its own children. The walls that once protected the community now enclosed a divided body. At night, The city under faction must have felt different. Lamps burned behind shutters, doors were barred, voices lowered when footsteps passed outside. A knock after dark could mean a messenger, a search, an arrest, or an assassination. Sacred places, once centres of shared worship, might become locations of oath-taking, refuge, or murder. The marketplace, once noisy with trade, could become a theatre of accusation. The same stones remained, but their meaning had changed. Civil war also damaged the gods of the city, at least in human experience. The festivals might continue, but unity had been hollowed out. Sacrifices offered by one faction could disgust another. Oaths sworn in temples might be broken when expedient. Supplicants might be dragged from altars. Sacred language might be used to bless revenge. For a culture in which political and religious life were closely intertwined, factional banishment was not only social rupture, it was spiritual disfigurement. A city at war with itself could no longer easily imagine the gods smiling upon it. The exiles outside the walls had their own rituals of memory. They might gather before battle and name the homes they had lost. They might swear to restore ancestral graves, punish traitors, and reclaim property. They might tell younger men stories of streets they barely remembered, turning home into a sacred inheritance of anger. Children raised among exiles could inherit a city they had scarcely known, not as a place of ordinary childhood, but as a stolen destiny. This inheritance was powerful and dangerous. A generation born into displacement may carry sharper fantasies than those who actually lived the lost life. The parents remember complexity, debts, neighbours, disputes, bad harvests, compromises. The children hear a purified legend. We were wronged. Our enemies stole everything. Return will make the world whole. Thus exile can distill history into vengeance. It can turn a political defeat into a family religion. When such exiles returned with force, the city often faced terror in reverse. Those who had once expelled others now feared expulsion themselves. Men who had taken property hid documents, fled to sanctuaries, or sought foreign help. Former victims became judges. Former rulers became fugitives. The wheel turned, and the road filled again. This is why mass banishment was one of the most destabilizing practices in Greek political life. It did not solve conflict. It stored conflict outside the walls, where it fermented. It turned citizens into enemies with memory, organization, and cause. It made geography into a temporary arrangement rather than a moral settlement. The city could announce peace, but its exiles counted the days. At its darkest, exile became an alternative to massacre, but only barely. Instead of killing opponents immediately, a faction removed them and left open the possibility of future war. Bloodshed was postponed, displaced, and multiplied. The violence moved from the square to the frontier, from public execution to raids, plots, and returns. Banishment looked cleaner than slaughter, but beneath its surface lay an unfinished battle. This was the terrible genius of Greek civil strife. It understood that a human being could be attacked through belonging. To expel a rival was to break his public life while keeping him alive enough to suffer, scheme, and remember. To expel many rivals was to create a wounded people outside the city, bound together by loss. In the fierce mathematics of faction, exile was punishment, strategy, warning, reward, and provocation all at once. The road beyond the walls became crowded with political ghosts. They were not dead. That was precisely the problem. They walked, spoke, bargained, trained, prayed, waited, and remembered. They remained part of the city's story because the city had not destroyed them, only displaced them. Their absence shaped every council meeting, every property claim, every military alarm, every rumour of ships offshore. The Greeks feared banishment because they knew it could become contagious. One exile might be a tragedy. A faction of exiles might be an army. A generation of exiles might become a destiny. and a city that learned to expel its enemies too easily might discover that it had taught every citizen to fear the next turn of fortune. In the end, civil war revealed the deepest civic nightmare. The city, imagined as one body, could raise its hand against itself. It could cut away limbs and call the wound healing. It could drive its own people into darkness and declare the streets purified. It could replace justice with victory, memory with propaganda, and belonging with suspicion. And when dawn came over the walls, the city still stood. But part of it was walking the roads outside, waiting for the day when the gates might open again. Return was the dream that kept many exiles alive, and the nightmare that kept many cities awake. For the banished, return was more than movement back across distance. It was restoration of breath. It was the imagined moment when the road ended, when the harbour appeared in dawn light, when the old hills rose from the sea, when the gates no longer stood as a barrier but as an opening. In exile, a man could endure hunger, insult, foreign speech, dependency, and sleeplessness because somewhere in the mind burned the picture of home recovered. Yet the home to which an exile returned was never the home he had left. Time had entered the city without him. Children had grown. Elders had died. Enemies had prospered. Friends had learned caution. Houses had changed hands. Fields had been harvested by others. Names had been praised or cursed in his absence. The city preserved familiar stones, but not familiar innocence. Every street could offer recognition and estrangement in the same breath. The returning exile stood at a threshold both sacred and dangerous. At first, there might be joy. Relatives running from doorways, old companions embracing with tears, servants staring as though at a ghost, a mother touching the face of a son she had imagined dead in all but name. Children, now taller than memory allowed, looking upon a father whose voice belonged to stories. The hearth might be rekindled, offerings might be made, a meal might be prepared with trembling hands. The house, for a night, might seem to breathe again. But joy did not settle every claim. Who had occupied the property? Who had profited from the exile's downfall? Who had denounced him in the public square? Who had remained silent when his name was attacked? Who had protected his family? Who had abandoned them? The returning man carried a private list. Even when he spoke gently, his eyes moved across rooms and faces like an auditor of injury. The city might proclaim reconciliation, but memory sat beside every cup. Return could heal only if the city found a way to govern memory. For this reason, amnesty became one of the most delicate instruments in Greek political life. An amnesty was not forgetfulness in the ordinary sense. No one truly forgot confiscated fields, dead relatives, betrayal, fear, and years lost beneath foreign skies. Rather, amnesty was a public agreement that certain wrongs would not be pursued in law or revenge. It was a controlled silence imposed for the survival of the community. Such silence required discipline almost beyond human nature. To live beside the man who had accused you, to pass in the marketplace the person who bought your seized land, to sit in assembly with a former enemy, to sacrifice to the same gods with citizens who once wished you gone, to accept that the city could continue only if wounds were not opened every morning. This was not weakness. It was a severe civic art. Yet not all returns were shaped by mercy. Some came with weapons. A group of exiles might re-enter through force, by night assault, internal betrayal, foreign soldiers, or sudden uprising. Then return became reversal. The men who had slept comfortably in confiscated houses woke to footsteps in the street. Records were seized. Opponents fled. Sanctuaries filled with frightened suppliants. The language of justice thickened with the taste of vengeance. Those who had once driven others out now learned how narrow the road could be when fortune turned. The returning exile often believed revenge would restore balance. It rarely did. Revenge could satisfy one wound while creating 10 more. A murdered enemy left sons. A confiscated estate created another displaced household. Public executions frightened some citizens and radicalized others. The city that welcomed returning exiles as saviours could soon fear them as avengers. The moral clarity of suffering could dissolve once the sufferers held power. To have been wronged did not guarantee wisdom. Pain could make a man merciful, but it could also make him exact. The Greeks understood this instability with brutal clarity. Their histories and dramas are filled with returns that do not bring peace. A king comes home and is murdered in the bath. A son returns to avenge a father and stains himself with a mother's blood. A dispossessed faction returns to the city and begins the cycle anew. The journey home, so long desired, can become the door through which old demons enter. In political life, the problem was practical as much as moral. A restored exile wanted property back, but another person might have legally acquired it under the regime that expelled him. What then? Return the land and create a new enemy? Confirm the sale and deepen the exile's bitterness? Offer compensation from public funds and anger taxpayers? Divide estates and satisfy no one? The city's stones might be ancient, but its legal knots were painfully modern. Property was only one matter. Offices had changed. Alliances had shifted. Marriages had been arranged in absence. A daughter might have married into a family the exile hated. A son might have adapted to the new order. A wife might have managed so long without him that his authority returned awkwardly. Friends might have compromised with enemies in order to survive. The returning man could find that loyalty, in his absence, had become complicated. This complexity was often intolerable to those who had suffered. The exile might imagine that time at home had stood still in expectation of his return. It had not. The city had gone on living, which could feel like another betrayal. Markets had opened, festivals had continued, babies had been born, songs had been sung, men had laughed in courtyards. The terrible discovery was that one's personal catastrophe had not stopped the world. Home had survived without him. That knowledge could wound the pride as sharply as the original sentence. For the city, receiving exiles required ritual law and emotional restraint. Oaths might be sworn. Lists of restored citizens might be read. Boundaries might be redrawn. Sacred ceremonies might mark renewal. Public words mattered, because they tried to create a shared reality stronger than private rage. The city had to say, in effect, we begin again. Not because the past is harmless, but because the future cannot be built entirely from accusation. Such beginnings were fragile. A careless insult could reopen years of resentment. A lawsuit over land could become a political trial in disguise. A festival seating dispute could awaken old factional lines. A drunken remark at a banquet could remind everyone who had fled and who had profited. The surface of peace might remain calm while dark currents moved beneath it. Every restored community lived with the possibility that memory would find a crack. Yet some cities did manage moments of remarkable restraint. Their achievement should not be underestimated. To bring exiles home without immediate slaughter required more than legal drafting. It required exhaustion with violence, respect for oaths, fear of renewed catastrophe, and a willingness by enough citizens to swallow grief for the sake of survival. In such moments, the city showed another face. Not the devouring body that expelled, but the wounded body trying to close itself without infection. The returned exile had to change as well. He could not step back into his old life as though years had no weight. He had to learn the altered city. He had to decide which insults could be endured, which claims pursued, which memories carried privately, which anger surrendered. He had to recognize those who had remained behind as people who had also survived pressures he had not seen. He had to resist the intoxicating purity of victimhood. That may have been his hardest test. For some, return brought humility. They had seen foreign courts, mercenary camps, poverty, dependency, and the uncertain mercy of strangers. They understood how fragile civic life was. Such men might return with a wider vision, more cautious about faction, more aware that every sentence of exile could become a future war. Their suffering might deepen the city if the city allowed them to speak without turning pain into domination. For others, return brought only appetite. They came back hungry for honour, repayment, property, office, blood, applause, and public recognition of innocence. They wanted the city to confess its wrongdoing through gifts, punishments, and submission. Such desires were understandable, but dangerous. A man consumed by restoration could become a tyrant of memory. He could demand that all public life revolve around his injury. In trying to recover himself, he could make the city hostage to his wound. This is why amnesty was not merely a legal device. It was a struggle over the soul of the community. Can a city remember without becoming prisoner to remembrance? Can victims return without becoming persecutors? Can former enemies share sacrifices without lying to the gods? Can property be settled without pretending loss was small? Can children inherit peace instead of rehearsed grievance? These questions do not belong only to ancient Greece. They belong to every society that has known expulsion, civil conflict, confiscation, return, and the terrible labour of living together again. The ancient Greeks, for all their brilliance, never found a permanent answer. They improvised. They swore oaths. They broke oaths. They restored exiles. They expelled new ones. They forgave. They remembered. They raised monuments. They destroyed houses. They held trials. They silenced trials. Their cities moved between vengeance and restraint like ships between rocks in a narrow channel. Still, in the image of return there remains a strange tenderness. A man places his foot again upon the soil of his birth. A woman sees a husband or son coming up the road. A family opens a door. A hearth receives flame. A name, once spoken in bitterness, is spoken in welcome by at least one voice. The city may not be healed. The past may not be forgiven. But for a moment, beneath the morning light, the human longing for place is answered. And that is why return was so powerful. Exile made home sacred through deprivation. It turned ordinary streets into objects of desire. It taught the banished that the smallest details of belonging, a familiar wall, a known voice, a family grave, a festival song carried on evening air, could become treasures beyond silver. When return came, those details blazed with painful brightness. But the road home did not erase the road away. The returned exile carried both. He was citizen and stranger, victim and danger, memory and disruption. He stood inside the gates, yet part of him remained on the roads where he had waited, suffered, bargained, and changed. The city that received him received not the old man, but a transformed one. In that transformation lay hope, and also peril. For every return asked the city to perform a miracle, to take back what it had cast out, and to survive the reunion. At the end of the ancient road stands a human figure without a city. No army surrounds him now. No assembly shouts his name. No pottery shard is lifted in a citizen's hand. No decree is being carved into stone. There is only the road, the wind, the memory of walls, and the immense silence that follows when a person has been separated from the place that once gave life its shape. This is why ancient Greek banishment still disturbs us. It speaks to a fear older than law and sharper than politics. The fear of losing belonging. Human beings are not made only of flesh and thought. They are made of rooms, voices, paths, graves, meals, childhood light, repeated greetings, remembered festivals, and the small geography of affection. A person may carry courage within, but he still longs for a door that opens without question. He still longs for a name spoken by those who know its history. He still longs for a place where memory does not require explanation. The Greeks understood this with painful clarity. Their cities could be harsh, jealous, and unforgiving, yet they also revealed something profound about human life. To belong was to be seen. To be seen was to be held within a shared world. The city gave identity its public face. It told each person where he stood among the living and the dead. It connected the individual to gods, laws, ancestors, neighbours, rivals, and descendants. It gave meaning to sacrifice, burial, honour, duty, and speech. Exile shattered that arrangement. The punishment was feared because it reached into all the chambers of existence. It removed the body from familiar streets. It removed the voice from political life. It threatened the household, property, marriage, burial, reputation, and memory. It turned the citizen into a stranger and forced him to discover whether anything remained when the city withdrew recognition. Some found bitterness, some found philosophy, some found violence, some found humility, some found only hunger and dust. The dark truth is that banishment did not merely send a person away. It asked whether a human being could survive the loss of the world that named him. The Greeks gave many answers, none complete. Myth imagined the exile as cursed, sacred, polluted, or chosen. Politics treated him as dangerous, useful, humiliating, or necessary. Philosophy asked whether the soul could remain free when the body was driven out. Families knew him as absence. Enemies knew him as a threat. Foreign kings knew him as an opportunity. The city knew him as a problem it had failed to bury. There is a reason the image endures, a man standing beyond the walls, looking back. Behind him lies the life he knew. Ahead of him lies uncertainty. The road may lead to poverty, service, vengeance, wisdom, or death. The gods may watch with mercy, indifference, or anger. The city may forget him, fear him, need him, or one day call him home. But in that first moment of departure, everything is suspended. He is still himself, and yet the world has declared him altered. The terror lies in that in-between state. Not dead, yet removed from the living pattern. Not foreign by birth, yet treated as foreign by law. Not erased, yet denied presence. Not free, because longing binds him. Not imprisoned, because roads remain open. Exile is a strange punishment because it offers motion without belonging, survival without completion, and memory without touch. We still understand this, even across the vast distance of centuries. Modern people may live under different laws, speak different languages, and imagine identity in more private terms, yet the ancient fear has not vanished. To be cut off from home, family, nation, community, or memory remains one of the deepest human wounds. Refugees, political dissidents, deported peoples, displaced families, and those cast out by their own communities all know some version of the old road. The forms change. The ache remains. The ancient Greek exile therefore stands not as a museum curiosity, but as a mirror. He asks us what home means. Is it soil? Is it law? Is it blood? Is it language? Is it memory? Is it the place where the dead are buried? Is it the people who pronounce our names correctly, with history inside the sound? Or is home something carried inward, a flame guarded against every wind? The Greeks never settled the question, and perhaps no civilization ever can. They built cities of astonishing beauty and fierce intelligence, cities where drama, philosophy, mathematics, politics, sculpture, and history took forms that still shape the world. Yet those same cities could turn upon their own people. They could decide that safety required expulsion. They could make a man homeless in the name of order. They could confuse justice with fear and mercy with slow ruin. That contradiction is not a flaw in the story. It is the story. Civilization has always contained tenderness and violence together. The walls that shelter also exclude. The laws that protect also punish. The community that gives meaning also possesses the power to withdraw it. Ancient Greek exile forces us to look steadily at this double nature. It shows the city as sanctuary and judge, mother and executioner, memory keeper and memory thief. And still, among the ruins, there is dignity. There is dignity in the households that endured shame and uncertainty. There is dignity in the mothers who remembered sons when cities condemned them. There is dignity in the children who carried damaged names into adulthood. There is dignity in those who returned and chose restraint over revenge. There is dignity even in the lonely wanderer who, stripped of public honour, refused to let suffering make him monstrous. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps new inscriptions will surface from buried civic archives. Perhaps stratigraphic excavation will reveal another layer of political violence beneath a ruined street. Perhaps radiocarbon dating will sharpen the chronology of a destruction horizon. Perhaps genomic data will trace patterns of displacement in ways earlier scholars could scarcely imagine. Perhaps a broken grave marker, a seal, a property list, or a name scratched into clay will give us one more human fragment from this long history of separation. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The greatest losses of exile were not always carved, buried, or preserved. They passed through breath, tears, silence, and memory. They lived in the final look at a doorway, the last offering at a household hearth, the road dust on a cloak, the foreign meal eaten without appetite, the old song heard years later in another land. Archaeology can guide us to the threshold. Imagination, disciplined by evidence, must listen at the door, and so we leave the ancient exile where we first found him. Beyond the walls, beneath a sky crowded with gods, stars, and unanswered questions, the city behind him is lit by lamps. Somewhere inside, bread is being broken, a child is being put to sleep, a priest tends an altar, a magistrate locks away records, a neighbour repeats a rumour, a wife waits without knowing whether waiting is wisdom or torment. Life continues, as life always does, with a cruelty and beauty almost impossible to bear. The exile turns away, his shadow lengthens on the road. The stones remember nothing, yet the story remains. He walks into darkness not because he has ceased to matter, but because his suffering reveals how much belonging has always mattered. To be human is to seek a place in the world. To be banished is to learn how fragile that place can be. And perhaps that is the final lesson of ancient Greek exile. A city is more than walls, and a human being is more than a citizen. Yet when the bond between them is broken, both are changed. The exile loses home. The city loses innocence. What remains is history, patient, sorrowful, and unfinished, waiting among broken pottery, weathered stones, and the silence beyond the gate. End of script and good night.